Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The newly elected Starmer government is facing a major test as violent social unrest flares across Britain. The government has blamed disinformation and far-right influence for UK's worst rioting in 13 years, triggered by a stabbing that left 3 young girls dead and many injured in a week ago in an English town. So what is the latest in the unrest? How is the government handling it? And what more does this violent disorder reveal about the deep and growing division within the UK? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Jinduo. Joining me today are Professor Iain Begg from the London School of Economics and Political Science, David Ferguson, Honorary Chief of Foreign Languages Press, and Zhang Biao, Associate Professor at China University of Political Science and Law. Welcome to Dialogue. David, I will start with you. So several cities in the UK, have been plunged into chaos over the past week. And of course, over the incident of the stabbing 3 children dead, others injured. It is believed to be the most serious unrest in the UK in 13 years. So what's the latest on the ground? Are we going to see the decline of this violence soon?
Well, I think that it's the most serious disorder since 2011, when we had a similar outbreak of rioting. One of the features that is interesting, worth being aware of, is that you mentioned it as a UK phenomenon. It's presented in the British media as a UK phenomenon. But in fact, until the disorder spread to Belfast a couple of nights ago, it was purely an English phenomenon. There isn't anything happening in Wales, and there isn't anything happening in Scotland. Now, it's a very subtle point, but if you genuinely want to understand all of the nuances, and if you genuinely want to understand all of the factors behind it, it's important to understand, 1, that it is an English phenomenon, and 2, to understand why. I don't think that this is a subtlety that we can get into a great deal of detail this evening, but it is worth being aware of that point.
Thank you, David, for pointing out those nuances and this fact. I mean, that's important to understand fully about what's going on. Professor Zhang Biao, if you compared this round of unrest to what happened like 13 years ago in 2011, I believe, how do you see, how different are they?
Well, I think the two kinds of events are somehow similar, of course, but also there are very serious differences. For instance, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer has described what we are witnessing as pure violence rather than riots or protests. So he actually used the term violence. So that means what we are witnessing, what is happening on the ground in the UK, is something more serious than riots or protests. So, I mean, in that sense, things are somehow more violent and are more large scale than what happened several years ago.
David, do you agree? I mean, how do you characterize this round of, whatever you call it, like social disorder, unrest, violent protests? I mean, who are those people on the street?
I think it's important to recognize that it's not a single cause issue. There is a huge amount of alienation and a huge amount of frustration and anger not only in the UK, but spread around the West. I mean, we've just had an election in the UK. We've had the Labour Party elected with a thumping majority, but only about half of the eligible electorate voted. And of that electorate, of that half, only a third of them voted for the Labour Party. So you have a party in power with a thumping majority, one of the biggest majorities ever, but its actual popular support base is very, very narrow. And I think if you want to understand again the reasons behind this, you have to look beyond the immediate causes and look for the reasons for alienation and frustration and anger among a very large proportion of the population.
Let's take a look at this, the direct causes, probably the direct cause rather. I mean, the stabbing incident of three young girls. Professor Zhang, of course, this is not really rare. I mean, this could have happened in any country. There's incident, criminal incident, and then you need probably police investigation and they find out what happened. That's it, according to the procedure. But somehow, why this particular incident, leading to such a large-scale unrest in different cities?
Oh, I think there are two things here. One of them is that the things happened really in a small town where it was really peaceful and tranquil. So that means people were really, really shocked by the incident. When you have a teenager who is nearly 18 attacked three girls and other 10 people, so that was a huge shock to the local people. So that's one of the things. So the second thing I would think is that the English Defense League, that the far right group, plays a really huge role in organizing and sending people to protest. So the far right activist groups has played a very important role in hyping up the importance of the issue and in spreading misinformation about who has been doing that, and by directing attack towards the Muslim community.
Okay, so people would say, if you look at the media, basically all the far right activists, they are not happy with the immigrants, are not happy with this immigration policy. I mean, actually, in the social media, one of the people who is considered probably one of the leaders, people call it Robinson, right? Tommy Robinson. He basically said that what it is about. It's really about their grievances, about the failure of the government policies. Does he refer to this immigration failure, policy failure?
I can't remember exactly, but it seems to me that Tom Robinson was an alias for the leader of the English Defense League. So of course, people from the English Defense League would probably blame the government for their failure in tackling the small boat crossing the channel, blaming them for the failure for tackling immigrant issues. But what seems to me is important is very clearly that people are taking advantage of this event and people are exploiting the opportunity of this event by making it something more violent, serious, large-scale, anti-foreigner. So I would think, of course, there have been something wrong with the British government immigration policies. But also the English Defense League, the far right activist group, plays a part in taking the advantage of that failure.
David, it looks to me that the media, British media and the government, they are blaming, on one hand, the social media, on the other hand, the right-wing activists. It presents the right-wing activists, we don't know exactly who they are. It's like they are completely the wrong side, the wrong party. Do they have any legitimate grievances here?
Yes, I'm sorry, was that question directed at me? I was getting a lot of interference on audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do. David, here's a question.
I'm sorry, you'll have to... Yeah.
Earlier you also mentioned about this right-wing, let's say, election, not only in the let's say European Parliament, for example. In the UK, people in general see the rise of the right-wing politics, political parties. I mean, their grievances about the failure of immigration policy. Do you see there's any legitimacy to their grievances, or do you agree with the government? Basically, they are the bad guy, in this unrest.
There are some fundamental problems in British society, and Britain's political system is very ill-equipped to deal with them. People have grievances, and to some extent, the legitimate grievances. And Professor Zhao, you mentioned Tommy Robinson and the English Defence League. They are very specifically focused on immigration as the problem. But I genuinely believe that is a catalyst, that's a fuse rather than the explosives. There's no doubt in my mind that there is an organised group who are fomenting disorder, but there is a very much broader level of anger and frustration and alienation. And you need to understand that, and you need to be able to address it if you're going to resolve the problem. And the UK political system is not good at creating long-term solutions for fundamental problems.
Okay.
There is a problem with immigration for sure.
David, what are those frustration, anger, and this, this, let's say, ill feeling toward the government?
Well, part of it is very clearly economic. A lot of people are struggling financially. And when people are struggling financially, when ordinary people who don't have a deep understanding of finance, and they don't have a deep understanding of economics, and they don't have a deep understanding of social phenomena, when they find themselves in that situation, they will look for scapegoats. And the very obvious scapegoat is the thing that's very visible. And a person with a different colour of skin from your own, a person who's new to your country, a person who doesn't share your cultural background becomes an obvious scapegoat. And I think that is part of what the phenomenon that we're seeing. But fundamentally, when only half of the electorate turn out to vote in an election, it's a sign that there's something wrong. And we need to ask ourselves what that thing is. And that's where we need to look for the problem, and that's where we need to look for the solution.
Professor Zhang, do you see, the fundamental reasons or deep causes somehow go beyond this particular incident?
Yes, I think, first of all, before answering that question, I think I have to say that I agree 100% with David saying that we need to look at the issue from a broader perspective. Especially, we need to focus on the frustration and anger generated by the failure of the British government to tackle immigrant issues. I think that's one of the things that we really need to work on. And also, regards to the question, I think what is really important is that, of course, economics play a very huge part, as David has pointed out. I would add that racial issues and tensions between different social groups between the whites and the ethnic minorities might also play a very big part in triggering this event. So at the bottom, I would think the tensions between the social groups would be more important in explaining the violence.
Racial issue, are you saying that people are targeting, for example, Muslim groups or attacking the mosques? In one instance, you do see like an Asian man driving a car was surrounded by a group of white young men. Are you saying those people are somehow being targeted? But of course, we talked about immigration policy. There are refugees from Ukraine. They're not that visible. So that's not a problem to those people?
Well, I think the people from, especially the refugees from Ukraine is, of course, Eastern Europeans, they have been flown to the UK ever since the Second World War, and after the Russian-Ukraine conflict, you have also witnessed a lot of a huge flow of Ukrainians into the UK. But unfortunately, all these Ukrainians are ethnically non-Asian. They are not Muslims. So what is really interesting in this case is that the violence were really targeting the ethnic minorities with a Muslim religion and with most of the Asian or African background. So I was watching interviews published in, for instance, Channel 4 ITV. So most of the interviewees were terrified, especially when they were in the mosques. And most of the interviewees were actually African or African minorities with they are Muslims.
Professor Zhang, are you talking about this first generation immigrant, they born outside of the UK and then migrated to the UK, or you are talking about the people who were born in the UK, but they are Muslims and they go to the mosques?
Well, I think the issue is here. So, for instance, let me give you an example. For instance, the attacker is actually a British citizen, and he is the second generation of immigrants. So the attacker was black. The attacker was not a part of the Muslim community, if I remember correctly. So I think there is a problem here about whether you are British, but whether you are ethnic minority, or whether you are ethnic minority but you immigrated from foreign countries. So the identity issue is really a problem here.
So David, do you agree identity issue or racial discrimination also at play as a factor here?
Very much so, very much so. Let me give you a counterexample. One of the cities I know well in China is Jilin. In Jilin city, there is a very substantial population of Muslims, tens of thousands of them, and they have a large Muslim quarter. Now, I would feel no hesitation, I would feel no discomfort at all about my wife or my daughter walking through that area alone at any time of the day or night. But the important difference is that Muslim community has been there for hundreds of years. If you look at the Muslim community in the UK, for example, or the African community in the UK, there is a long history of interaction, but the vast majority of people are recent arrivals. There is no differentiation, there's no social differentiation between Muslims and Han Chinese in Jilin. In the UK, there are differentiations, there are quarters, there are areas, there's a lack of integration. And in order to help people to integrate in situations like that, where large numbers of them are new arrivals, you need very clear policies, and you need to have a very clear understanding of the social factors that affect both communities, the host community and the new migrants. And if you don't have that understanding, you're not going to achieve integration, you're going to achieve the opposite, you're going to achieve differentiation, and you're going to end up with the kind of problems that we're seeing now in the UK.
David, basically, are you talking about, when we say immigration policy failure, are you referring to basically this, probably the lack of integration or the lack of success in integration? If you compare the situation to that in the US, for example, where people would say probably the integration is goes on much better than that in the UK or in the European countries?
Well, it takes a long time. If you look at the problems in the USA, there are serious racial tensions between the white and the black communities. The black community has been there for a long time now, almost 200 years, but there are still tensions. It's something that takes time and it takes a huge amount of effort. And I think to a certain extent, the grievance among those who are termed the far right in the UK is that they have been made the targets. There's a progressive mindset that the British Empire was a bad thing. We invaded countries, we displaced populations, and that's all true. But it's as if the progressive mindset sees the British working classes as the people who should be punished for that. They should pay the bill. They should suffer the consequences. I certainly think that is how many people in the British working class community see it. They are being punished by the progressive mindset for crimes of their ancestors that they don't see as being something that they should be held responsible for.
So, Professor Zhang, are we seeing this kind of a division? On the right side, you have this far right, activists. On the other side, you have people who are let's say, bias, anti-discrimination, who are more progressive. Is that kind of division existing in the society in the UK?
Well, absolutely. we can see very clearly the opposition of the far right activist groups against the more middle and center people. So if I can't remember exactly when, but I actually witnessed one of the march of the English Defence League several years ago when I was in Exeter. So it was a very shocking show to me. And so when I was witnessing that, I felt that you have a lot of feelings about that. So if you come from a more centralized position, then you will probably fight back against them. And so in that case, you're seeing really a kind of division between the far right and the more centralized and the central left people in the British society.
Mm-hmm. David, beyond this immigration issue, what are other topics or issues, because we're talking about this far right group, they are concerned with?
Yeah. I think I'd like to add a level of subtlety there. The whole thing is being categorized as an issue of the far right. Far right as an expression in the UK, excuse me, is becoming rather debased in the sense that anyone who doesn't support the progressive stereotypical mindset is now being portrayed as far right. For example, radical feminists with decades of background as left-wing activists are being portrayed as far right because they don't support the transgender agenda. Now, I think if we categorize this as a far right problem, we're crediting a large number of people who are involved in these disturbances with something that they don't have, which is political awareness and political ideology. There's no doubt that there is a far right movement with political awareness and political ideology, whether you agree with it or not. But people don't go and loot shoe shops because of their far right political ideology. They loot shoe shops because they're angry and because they're frustrated and because they're part of a mob and because somebody's smashed the window of the shoe shop. And we need to be absolutely clear that a lot of the people who are involved in this disorder, to categorize them as far right is crediting them with, frankly, a level of political intelligence that they don't have. There's more to it than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, now we have Iain Begg. Iain, give us a portrait of those people, of those involved in the unrest. And who are those people? And from the short video clips online available, you see they are mostly young, like white people. Is that the case? And what are the grievances here?
But in the current stance of riots, yes, it's predominantly young white men. Though the occasional drunk woman seems to have joined in places like Sunderland, where she came out of the pub, noticed there was a riot going on and joined in. They are mostly, I think it's probably not unreasonable to say this, partly joining in because it's fun. You remember the waves of football hooligans 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's the same kind of background, people who enjoy having a fight. They want to join in a fight. The police are a nice target for them, and it's an easy form of entertainment. So I think we should be fairly clear that this is not systematic political violence, it's opportunistic, and that opportunism is a key part of the story.
Okay, the government has, and also the media, has blamed the social media, in fermenting or spreading misinformation, disinformation about the incident that led to this unrest. And also on X.com, formerly known as Twitter, Elon Musk said that he warned the civil war is inevitable in the UK. I want your response to that.
My response to Elon Musk is one word: drivel. Complete drivel. He doesn't know anything about what's happening in the UK, and he should keep his mouth shut, or his opinions on X suppressed. it's quite clear that there's been a factor of social media influencing what's going on, in that some of the initial posts were suggesting the perpetrator of the violence that killed these 3 young girls was someone who had come over the English Channel in a boat and therefore was an illegal migrant. Turned out to be completely false. So this spreading rapidly through social media of these myths has been a factor in all of what has developed. But I think we should not lose sight of the wider influence of the impact of many years of very high levels of migration on things like public services, which cause a broader discontent than just the 2 things I mentioned, the opportunism and the reaction to these horrific killings.
Well, Professor Zhang, if let's say, let's assume there's no this kind of like a cost of living crisis, no this energy pressure, no inflation, do you think such incident will also lead to like a social disorder like this one?
Yeah, I think so. I think David has been saying this for a long time, that actually the frustration and anger with the immigration policy has been one of the key causes of the violence. So probably the living crisis and energy cost crisis has been adding up to the issues, have been giving people more grievances. But I would think, as David has been arguing, that actually the frustration with the immigration policy has been really one of the driving forces of this event.
David, in many cases, usually you would see like social unrest that would lead to like regime change. But in the case of the UK, you do have the opposite. Basically, you have a new government, and then somehow people went on the street and protest. So, I mean, how big impact that will have on this new government? Is this a long-term or short-term, long-term or short-term challenge for the Starmer government?
It's a long-term challenge that the government is not going to be able to respond to, because they're not set up to deal with long-term problems. They don't have the talent. That kind of person doesn't rise high in British politics. I'd really like to come back on the question you asked about Elon Musk, though. I mean, first of all, he's completely wrong to suggest that this could turn into civil war, because the British people don't have any weapons, so we're not going to have a civil war. But what is more interesting to me in the context of the response to his comments, it's barely 1 week since that man was actively inciting violence and disorder in Venezuela following the election there. Nobody had any criticism of that. If these events were happening in Hong Kong and Elon Musk was cheering them on, he'd be a hero and a champion. And there is a vast amount of total hypocrisy in the response to Elon Musk and in the broader issue of social media in terms of the UK establishment response to this. China is constantly criticised for its social media policies by the same people who are now talking about all kinds of draconian measures to quieten social media, to silence people on social media. And I think that is a point that's very important to make.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.